Hello and welcome to FREDERICK HOLMES and Company, Gallery of Modern and Contemporary Art located in Pioneer Square in Seattle, Washington. This month we're commemorating the 121st birthday of Seminal American Modernist Painter Walter Quirt, born in 1902 and died in 1968. So this is a special exhibition presenting his paintings, works on paper, and drawings. So enjoy. What we're looking at right now is an early painting, circa 1939, when Walter Quirt was known in New York as an American surrealist. He was actually chosen by the Museum of Modern Art when they were sponsoring a speaker symposium during their groundbreaking exhibition, Fantastic Art, DADA, and Surrealism, as one of the noted speakers on behalf of surrealism, along with another very prominent figure in the genre, Salvador Dali. That would have taken place in 1937 and 1938. So walk with me as we continue to explore the work of Walter Quirt. This is a beautiful late career painting. Let's get up close with it. This is entitled Female Figure, done in 1960. Quirt was highly regarded, of course, for his use of color. He had a brilliant sense of color, but more prominently, his use of line. Line was fundamental to everything Quirt did. This is incredible work on paper. This is an ink painting on paper, dated 1958. In 1960, Walter Quirt was given a retrospective by the American Federation of Arts with a grant from the Ford Foundation, which traveled through 17 cities between 1960 and 1962. The exhibition catalog, of course, lists all the paintings that were featured in that show, but there were also a handful of works on paper which were not listed but nevertheless were included in the show, and it's my belief that this is one of those paintings, one of those works on paper that was in fact included. It's a beautiful piece. It's untitled, simply subtitled Running Horse, 1958. This is a beautiful, I love this piece. It's a stunning work, really kind of archetypally modern. It's again untitled, it's simply entitled A Seated Modernist Figure, dated 1962, oil on canvas. Over here are a series of drawings. These, of course, are also untitled. Sometimes, of course, he simply didn't title these works, and other times, of course, the titles have simply been lost to history. These are some of the works on paper. Now, these are acrylic works on paper, unlike the previous ink painting on paper. By about 1960 or so, Walter Quirt had discovered acrylic, which had just recently been refined as a stable painting material. Prior to that, of course, it was an industrial material used in manufacturing, but it became a stable painting material in about 1960 through the efforts of the Golden Paint Company. So he embraced it very quickly and used it as a means of expressing his painting on paper, which of course then would dry much quicker and allowed him to explore his more expressionist side. This is a painting, again, untitled, but I've subtitled it Sgraffito Figure. Sgraffito being a word used usually in ceramics to describe the scratching effect. So that's what we see here in the face and in a portion of the body. Here's another work on paper. Again, acrylic on paper. This is entitled, again, excuse me, untitled. I've simply called it Contemplative Figure, dated 1963. Sorry about the lights and the reflections, but these are, of course, behind glass. This is one of the few non-objective abstract paintings that Walter Quirt did, again, untitled. This is done circa 1963. But this is what I mean by his use of the acrylic being able to dry very quickly and allowing him to work in a more non-objective mode. Beautiful sense of color again, great line, great brushwork. Horses, of course, are always very popular for Walter Quirt and his fans. This is simply a piece, again, untitled, that has been given the subtitle of Abstract Horse. This is dated 1961. This is another great example of Walter Quirt's use of line, where he just simply abandons the use of color and using simply black paint and white paint achieves just an incredible composition here of essentially what looks like multiple horses, but actually is just one horse. I had to count the legs to figure that one out. There's a stunning figure here. Let me back up a little bit here so we can get this. Again, untitled, subtitled Abstract Woman, circa 1962. I'm going to turn around here just for a moment so we can catch another one. This is again untitled, subtitled Figure in Wooden Chair, dated 1964. You can see the chair right there. Look what he's done with the face. It's interesting. And the kind of the suggestion of hair, waves of hair. This is one of my personal favorites. This is simply, again, untitled, but called Sitting Figure in Blue, dated 1964. We know that, of course, because it's signed and dated down there, September of 1964, 964. This is also subtitled Lake Harriet, because it's reminiscent of many of the Lake Harriet paintings that he did in the early to mid 60s. This is called simply subtitled Standing Figure in Pastels. This is dated 1964 also. This has more linear brushwork as opposed to some of the curvilinear brushwork that he does in some of the other paintings. This again is a good example of what I mean by his use of line, whereas certain paintings have the preponderance of curvilinear brushwork, which has a very specific emotional content to it, as opposed to the linear brushwork, which has another very specific emotional content to it. This is a work on paper. Again, I love this piece. It's very charming. A lot of people really like this. Subtitled simply Carousel Horse, and I called it that simply because of this vertical line running through it, and it's kind of a cartoonish looking horse, which reminded me simply of course, a carousel. I love this one. This is a great one. This is again untitled, simply called Figure in Doorway, using only a handful, very small, maybe 2 or 3 colors, pastels primarily, blues, lavenders, black. And you see here again, this is a great combination of curvilinear line that we see here, the curve and the counter curve, and at the same time, you know, this vertical and horizontal line integrated into it. Here's another charming horse, subtitled Shadow Horse, dated 1961. Again, relatively minimal use of color. He uses the horse oftentimes as his subject, not because he had a particular love of horses or raised horses or rode horses or anything like that. In fact, he didn't own or ride horses at all. He was a very small statured man. But primarily because the horse in its form, and of course it's a classical art form that's been used for centuries by artists, but in Quirt's mind, it embodied all of the linear elements that comprised his Quirt hypothesis, which had to do with how one could infer from the line preferences of line, obviously the line preferences from individuals and societies, kind of their social psychology. So we see here the vertical line, the horizontal line, and the curve of the horse. This is a fantastic painting from 1953. This was also featured in the American Federation of Arts retrospective tour that was given to Walter Quirt, which again traveled through 17 cities. This is simply called Two Women. Apparently Frederick Holmes doesn't know how to count. 2 women. Very soft, pastelish. A lot of, again, a lot of curves and counter curves. That's one of the things that really lends it its kind of the very placid, serene quality, is that there's no diagonal lines, sharp lines, vertical or horizontal, kind of cutting through the surface. It's all soft curvilinear lines, and that's echoed, of course, in the palette. There's another beautiful painting. This is called figure, let me get it closer. I think it's figure 232. Yes, figure 232, 1961. Now here is a great example of Quirt's use of color and line. Again, we see this use of the curvilinear and the counter curve in the figure itself, with these broad kind of patches of color that are just simply brilliant. Quirt, of course, is not too concerned about the detail or anything too literal in the figure. It's all, of course, very expressive. Figure 232, 1961. I'm going to swing over here. These are a few more ink paintings on paper, subtitled again. These are all from 1958. There's 3 of them from 1958. This is subtitled Exultant Figure. 1958, again, Woman in Profile. And 1958, Leaping Figure. Right behind my desk is a beautiful drawing that Walter Quirt did in 1964, called Three Figures. I had one of my collectors who described this as, frankly, his version of what Picasso would have done. I thought that was quite the compliment. And this was a very knowledgeable collector, I might add. Here are a few more works on paper. These are 2 pastels, again untitled. Rainbow Horse, 1965, and subtitled Figure and Chair, also 1965. This is one of the Lake Harriet paintings. It's untitled, but we know it's from the Lake Harriet painting, one from the Lake Harriet series, because it's frankly what's written on the back. This is 1962. It's an oil on canvas, measuring 30 by 40 inches. This is a beautiful piece called Classical Motif, done in 1960. It's interesting to note, I find that oftentimes the female figures, he does give them these very kind of, again, curvilinear, sensuous lines. Not always, certainly, but oftentimes. And again, relatively little use of color, a little bit of blue on the right, but predominantly, earth tones, blacks, grays, browns. This is a painting from 1959 called Figure 101. I'm going to back up a little bit here because it's horizontal. Figure 101. Really sensuous lines, bold use of color. Not as bold as the previous figure 232, but definitely bold. And a lot of great brushwork. Look at the brushwork we see right in here. Very expressive, very quick. He had a tremendous command of both color, line, and brush. Another figure. This is one of the from his Use of White series. This is simply called Use of White Seated Figure. There's actually a couple of Use of White seated figures, but they're all from 1961. Over here, one of my favorites, this is a painting called Memory. And Memory is, again, one of the paintings that was featured in that traveling retrospective sponsored by the American Federation of Arts, produced by the American Federation of Arts. And these paintings that were produced in the American Federation of Arts retrospective, most of them still bear the museum stamps from the AFA. And of course, their catalog, they have individual catalog numbers. So they still bear the stamps of the AFA retrospective, as well as the Minneapolis Institute of Art, which is where they finally landed, and that continued the exhibition. This is a beautiful little painting. This is simply called Pensive Girl. This is 1952. Kind of very drawing-like. And then one of the last ones is another painting that was featured in the traveling retrospective. This is called simply Horse and Man, 1959. And again, in contrast with many of the figures that we've looked at, where the emphasis is on the line emphasis on the curve and the counter curve, look at the kind of the real strong, kind of staccato-like brushwork here. Diagonal, vertical, horizontal line, particularly vertical, a lot of vertical line, which really kind of underscores the action of the painting. And of course, monochromatic for all intents and purposes. A little bit of beige in there, but predominantly, of course, black and gray. And then finally, this is a beautiful little painting that I happen to really love called Yellow Light. And this is from circa 1958. Again, it's almost entirely non-objectively abstract, except that we can see that there is, in fact, a figure in there. Quirt loved the figure. He would often say, "I like people." So figures were a prominent part of his oeuvre. So that concludes this month's show. That concludes this special show of Walter Quirt, A Legacy of American Painting. Walter Quirt's commemorative birthday show. His birthday was November 24th, or will be November 24th. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed this special presentation.